Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Hines Legal's webinar series this lovely Friday afternoon. I'm Chris Hines from Hines Legal. With me today, Frank Higginson, also from Hines Legal, funnily enough. Frank, welcome.
G'day, everyone.
And happy birthday, Frank.
Oh, why, thank you, mate.
See, this is how dedicated Frankie is. On his birthday, he is presenting a webinar. I think that's to be commended. Anyway, enough of that. As always, please like and share this event and this page, particularly if you get something out of it. And as always, thank you for making the effort to tune in. Today, we're talking about the very, very thorny issue of defamation, and particularly defamation as it relates to body corporate world. Before we begin, given the subject nature, it's probably a good idea to say to people that if you've got a current defamation proceeding, you're about to get involved in the current defamation proceeding, it's probably a really good idea to not mention any specifics of those cases. And maybe as a bit of a general rule of thumb, again, given the topic, think twice before you say something today. Mightn't be such a bad idea, I would suggest, Frank.
I completely agree. And one of the things when we're preparing content for defamation or talking about it, to the extent that we actually use the words that have been found to be defamatory, then we could be defaming the person as well. So, so I think today for me is a very high level thing. We could literally be here for hours talking about the minutiae of what goes on. So it's probably, we've got a lot of feedback on this one. We've got a lot of people that have logged in. And in Strata, I suppose, Chris, seeing more and more of it. Is that COVID related? Is that pressure related? Is it alcohol related?
All of the above, I would suggest, Frank. This topic comes from, so those of you who are regular viewers would know that 2 weeks ago we did a webinar on nuisance, and I think this topic flows pretty naturally from that, because at its heart, this is about communication, and more particularly about how you should and should not communicate with people. A lot of people go on about how social media has opened up a world of opportunity for people to have their say on things. That's great. Look, the ability for people to have a voice, to say things that previously they couldn't say. You can sit there and say, that's fantastic, and I guess it is. But it's also come with a downside, and that downside is that when you say something, it has potential to have big consequences depending upon what you say. It's very easy to sit behind a keyboard and fire off a few words, or fire off an email, or put a post on a page, but it stays there thereafter. And just because you delete something afterwards doesn't mean it's gone forever, does it, Frank?
No, what screenshots are for, isn't it? And forwards.
That's right. That's right. Look, the issue of defamation is something that we see and hear a lot of at Hines, whether it be because we are directly engaged in a defamation proceeding, or if people are suggesting it is happening. It's something that I used to hear and see a lot of in my time as commissioner as well. We used to see all the time people either call or write in and suggest that they had been defamed, they were being defamed, or words to that effect. I'd suggest that in a lot of cases, a lot of people did not comprehend what they actually meant by being defamed, and had an impression that did not stack up with the reality of it. With that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Frank. And I suppose, Frank, the first thing to say that defamation isn't just about Rebel Wilson and Jeffrey Rush in big cases in court, in the media, with millions and millions of dollars, is it? It usually is something else.
No, absolutely. And even yesterday, there was a judgment handed down in a case relating to a vet, where someone got what she alleged was poor service from a vet, posted something on Facebook and True Local about the vet overcharging, not being nice, shouldn't be allowed to look after pets, etc., etc. And that judgment was handed down literally yesterday, and she was found to have defamed him. So I suppose for me, like I said, we could be here for hours talking about the detail, and this, and I really do, I'll say dislike, I think there's stronger words for it. I hate those sessions and the legal stuff that starts with, There's no substitute for independent legal advice and getting your own specific advice about your own circumstances, because what Chris and I are definitely trying to do is to help people understand things legally without the need to have to go to lawyers. Like, that's the reality of it. But defamation is definitely one of those ones where you need to get your own advice.
That's right.
Yeah, it is, because they can become very emotional disputes. So in commercial disputes, people will settle them for commercial reasons, in terms of, Chris lets me down in a $50,000 deal and I agree to do a deal and walk away from the litigation for 30. That's okay. I'm not emotionally involved in it. It's a commercial decision. I trust 20 grand, I'm done. Defamation isn't like that. Defamation becomes very, very personal. So people will usually, and a lot of these matters are pursued for the principle of the thing, not necessarily for the commercial return.
Yep.
Because even yesterday, the vet, I think, got a judgment of 25 grand. There is no way knowing that he's going to come out of that ahead financially. But he has pursued that for the principle of it. So that's the number one thing. And if you're involved in these things, getting specific advice around it is really important. But I'll try to give you a 101 now in terms of at a very macro level. So defamation is one of those rare things that is a national regime across Australia. So all of the states have the same laws, which is unusual, because normally it's a state-based type jurisdiction thing from a constitutional perspective, and that's as close as I'll get to being a constitutional lawyer. And I've pulled from yesterday's vet judgment really some of the important provisions, which I'll just run through now in terms of what defamation actually is. So a statement's defamatory if it lowers someone's reputation in the eye of an ordinary, reasonable person. So that's not a subjective thing. That's not in your view. That's the ordinary person.
Right.
And the question isn't whether it's actually caused injury. It's a tendency of whether it has actually lowered the reputation. So injury is not necessarily a requirement, as much as that does come into damages. So if you're lowering someone's reputation, it really refers to sort of the esteem they're held with, you know, in terms of professional qualities, their competence, or their dealings. So for me, as a lawyer, I suppose the heart of what we do is honesty. So if someone published that Frank Higginson is a liar and a trust account fraudster, that would be absolutely defamatory of me, because that goes right to the heart of my professional reputation. Becomes a bit of a no-brainer. So the other thing with defamation is context. So a word on its own might be defamatory. A word read with other ones in context might not be. So it's important to sort of step back and not look at a single sentence, but look at the whole of the publication in the context of whether it has then caused those things. So that is defamation in its simplest form that I can describe it. Obviously, how you're personally responding to something that might be said about you might not be the same as what everyone else thinks. And that's really the big thing in these pieces of litigation. The next thing then is publishing. So this is where people actually publish the defamatory statement. And this is one where the major media companies in Australia have recently come a cropper in relation to Dylan Voller. So if you Google Dylan Voller, he was the, I think, Northern Territory detainee, where some media published some stories about him. People made comments on the media's Facebook page. Those comments were defamatory, and those media companies have been held liable for publishing that. So I think one of the big things that's really, when Chris and I saw that, was, hang on a minute, building Facebook pages.
Yep.
If you're in control of a Facebook page and someone gets on there and says that Chris has stolen money from what is corporate's general account, and that's defamatory, and you're letting that be published, so that's that very dangerous territory.
And of course, if your Facebook group happens to be called "All Body Corporate Managers Are Terrible," well, that's probably an issue to begin with.
It's a start. It's a start. So once you get something could be defamatory, it's published and other people see it, and the easiest way to do that in Strata is reply all.
Yep.
See that all the time, particularly late at night, particularly 3 minutes after an email's landed, but we'll talk about that in a minute as well. That then goes out to the world at large. So there was a case in New South Wales where tenants got sued by a chairperson in relation to effectively the security of a locked letterbox, wasn't it? Yep. It all started with the tenants not, according to the chairperson, locking the letterboxes and allowing people to steal, and it escalated from there.
Yeah.
So that's that grapevine effect. It spreads. So there are defences to defamation, and these can be really complex. Obviously, the first and most obvious one is truth. If you call me a trust account fraudster and I have defrauded my trust account, well, then that's not defamatory because it's true. The one we get in bodies corporate a little bit is qualified privilege. So that's the defence is that, well, I had a duty or an interest to make that statement, and the people who received it had a corresponding duty or interest to receive it. So again, that Frank, he's the chairperson of our body corporate, and he's a convicted trust account fraudster, and he should not be in charge of our body corporate funds. That might be an example for qualified privilege. And it also would be true, I suppose, if I had been convicted of trust account fraud. So, and they sort of all meld around. So the way it works, you've got something defamatory, it gets published. There are a number of defences, and there's a lot more than what those two simple ones I just mentioned there. That goes into the mix from a court perspective. And then, assuming that there has been defamation, what the court then looks at is, were amends made? Was there an apology offered? Was there an opportunity to try to sort it out? And to the extent that then goes to damages. And of course, then the harm caused and all that sort of thing. So that's mitigation. There's the ability to award aggravated damages and these sort of things, which is more than just what the damage might be. And I should say with qualified privilege, that needs to be a genuine, I suppose, circular of that information to people, not based on malice. So you can't quite hide behind that as a defence if you're actually only doing it to square up with someone, for want of a better phrase, which again is what we see a lot in Strata. So the other probably key thing with those elements is that defamation, there's a very structured process for it to start. So me writing a letter to you, say, you've defamed me and I want an apology, is not it. So there's a thing called a concerns notice that allows someone a statutory period of time to respond to it. Usually those things are drafted by lawyers because there's, again, the statutory prescription in terms of what they actually need to be. So a letter on its own saying you've defamed me, I want an apology, is probably not something necessarily to be, I suppose, at that stage, it's alert, not alarmed, back to the days of John Howard. Sorry, Chris, love the political jokes.
I think you're making a really good point here, which warrants it being emphasised, Frank. Just because somebody says you've defamed me doesn't mean that you're immediately up for $4 million worth of damages. It's just what somebody is saying, and what you are saying, Frank, is that that's not the formal start of any process anyway. But if somebody is saying that to you, that's a red flag that something's up.
Absolutely. And at that stage, it's a question of, and I suppose what we say to clients in defamation all the time. So if you came to me and said, I've been defamed, I want to do something about it, first thing I'm going to say to you is, great, here we go. That's expensive. So we need to do a concerns notice. Now, can't you just do a letter of demand? No. Because the first thing I say to clients when they get something that's not a concerns notice, this person isn't serious. Spend the money, invest the time, and then from our perspective, either on the giving end or the receiving end of those things, you need to make sure of what has actually been said and whether it is defamatory and whether there are defences, because there is no point at all making threats that you cannot follow through on.
That's right.
So you've defamed me, blah, 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 but if it's true, then it's not defamation. So there's no point even starting that fight. So like all pieces of litigation, and this is something that's the same with every bit of litigation, you need to make sure you do your groundwork before you start throwing stones. And
Frank, is part of that groundwork asking yourself the question, does it matter?
Yep. And how many times have we had the conversation about stuff going around in body corporate agendas when 99% of people don't read it?
Hey.
And it's you know, and the conversations I've had with clients over the years is, well, this has just gone out and this is what they've said about me, and I get that and it's not nice, but we've got 12 months from the publishing of something from a legal perspective to do something with respect to it. Let's leave it sit for a week and let me know the feedback you get. And almost all circumstances, the heat goes out of it, the pressure goes out, and that's, to be honest, those clients that ring me and have those conversations are ahead of the curve, because the other one would be writing back to the chairperson, copying the committee, copying everyone else that might be in the building to say, you are blah, 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 and then away we go.
And while we're talking about cases, there's another case which I think is really relevant here. I think it was in the District Court of Queensland where a lot owner sued for defamation on the grounds that that lot owner was referred to as unfinancial by the body corporate manager. That was thrown out, wasn't it, Frank?
It was. So when you get, and again, this is Defamation 101, I suppose. So the way it needs to work is that lot owner was declared unfinancial at a body corporate meeting. So the question for the court, the lawyers, and everyone involved in the proceeding is, from that person's perspective, what that statement about him imputed. What did that say to the world at large that he was? So his interpretation that he sued for from a defamation perspective, it said that he was a delinquent payer, he couldn't afford to pay his levies, that he had financial difficulties, and that he was insolvent. So basically, the way he read that and the way he said that people would take it was that I'm a financial mess.
Yep.
And that was held not to be right.
Indeed. So that's just that's a flip side. I mean, we talked about a couple of cases just before, but that is a flip side of the situation. We're going to move into our favourite topic here, which is prevention. So anyone who's heard Frank and I talk, we're big on prevention rather than cause and effect so much. Before we get into that, we've had a couple of questions. We might try and knock those over before we launch into the prevention side of things. Question from Guy. Hello, Guy. And I'll paraphrase it because it's a relatively long one. But basically, Guy's talking about a situation in which a scheme in which he was part had a stack of motions submitted by owners that he thought were defamatory. And given that the committee is obliged to take whatever motions are put forward by an owner and isn't in the business of editing or concealing or redacting them, what can be done about it in a situation where it seems like the purpose of those motions is just to discredit? A few things. There is absolutely zero issue with a body corporate manager or secretary going back to an owner and saying to the owner, are you sure you really want to proceed with these motions? There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And you can put that in as mild or as strong words as you really want, depending upon the situation. So, for example, if an owner sends in 100 motions and each one of those 100 motions is a stream of gibberish full of the most insulting, degrading things imaginable said about another owner, pick up the phone. If you're the committee or the body corporate manager, we've got your motions. Are you absolutely 100% sure you want to proceed with these? Do it by email if you want the paper trail. Are you absolutely sure? There's no harm, and there is absolutely nothing in the legislation which says you cannot invite somebody to reconsider what they're doing there. And then at that point, if they are adamant that they wish to proceed, well, frankly, on their own head be it, I would have thought. Frank, what do you think?
Absolutely. You know, and I suppose bodies corporates, usually if a motion is submitted before the close of the body corporate's financial year, it's got to go on the agenda for the AGM. Bodies corporates have protection for defamation if they're publishing material, and I think we'll get into the legalities of that in a week or two maybe. But committees don't have to put everything on an agenda. So if something is complete diatribe, propaganda, long verbose statements about how the whole world is unfair, then it is within the scope of scope of a committee not to include that on agenda. So that's probably a legal advice one. And even, mate, I suppose back in your role as commissioner, you would have seen some interesting material come in submissions, wouldn't you?
I did indeed. Thank you for that segue, Frank. It's almost as though we rehearsed that. No, look, I can think of a couple of instances as commissioner where we received material for disputes that were pretty confronting, and this is video footage, but it's still relevant, isn't it? The fact that it happens to be video footage. Really confronting images of other people. As commissioner, we are in no position to edit, redact, withhold somebody's evidence or information, so there's certainly no way we could have done that. But when I was presented with this from my officer at the time, who was equally as concerned, we decided that what we do is exactly what I just said. Contact the person and ask them, are you sure that you want this to go out, because this is going out to everybody. Every owner will get the opportunity to see this. So we invited them to reconsider, and that's one of the prevention points we're going to talk about in just a second. Are you absolutely sure you want to proceed with this? The answer in both cases, well, no, the answer was split. In one case, the answer was yes, I'm sure. In the other case, the answer was actually no, on reflection, we might reconsider. And eventually we took instructions from that party to withdraw, and then they resubmitted without that evidence. So that's one way of dealing with it.
Can I answer the question there from Warwick?
Yes, go ahead.
And I suppose thank you to everyone for the birthday wishes in the comments. Even I think my mother's watching this, but she hasn't actually rung me to say happy birthday yet. So see what present I get later on from her. So from Warwick, can a complete committee be defamed? I think so. You know, like to me, it's sort of making sure you'd have to draw a link when someone says this committee is a bunch of thieves, that everyone knows you're on the committee, which they may well, which then means that that's an immediate link to you. So yes, and I think the next question from Rian there, if there's no name or identifier to something, is the statement defamatory? Well, it might be defamatory, but in terms of who you're actually going to action would be something else entirely. And more importantly, from an AGM perspective, if there's no person actually submitting it, it doesn't go on the agenda.
That's right.
And I suppose, mate, you come back to anonymous correspondence. Like we've seen a lot of that. Actually, no, we'll talk about prevention. So this is, you know, again, trying to get out of the legal detail, actually how to stay out of these troubles is really what we're about.
And look, these are all pretty basic things, and I'm sure you've probably heard us talk about these before, but seriously, this is about getting yourself out of trouble, and not even getting yourself out of trouble, not getting into trouble in the first place. It's all common sense stuff, but in the heat of the moment, common sense stuff flies out the window. Body corporate disputes are all emotion all the time, in my experience. Why is that? Because we're talking about property, we're talking about property rights, we're talking about people's homes, we're talking about money for a lot of the time. So people get worked up. So first, very simply, pause. It's a really good word. Pause, reflect. Do you really want to say something before you send, post, or say something? And then the practical stuff. Draft it, put it in the drafts folder. Save it for 24 hours. I know you're a big fan of this one, Frank.
Huge fan.
24-hour rule. If you still feel the same way about it in 24 hours time, send it then. It's very unlikely you still feel the same way. One of my favorite ones, we've talked about don't do reply all, but one of my favorite ones, get someone to do a bitch check. So here's a fun fact. As commissioner, I had somebody vet emails for me if I felt like I was getting a bit too narky in my response. And my officer did a great job. Most of the time, she would end up saying, I don't think that was strong enough, Chris. But anyway.
I do the same thing. I really do. It's sort of, I'll dictate something, I'll settle it, and then I'll refer it to someone else who's not emotionally involved with that matter and say, just mark this up, tone this down. Am I on the right track?
That's right.
Because you just, you know, what is it? It's a person who acts for themselves has a fool for a client. It's the same thing, you know. It really is that second set of eyes that isn't emotionally involved like you.
Yep.
Perfect.
Absolutely. And then if you have said or sent something and thought better of it, think about retracting or deleting it. Look, it might be too late, but make the effort, I would be suggesting.
And mate, that absolutely goes to the heart of damages.
Yep.
If it was defamatory, straight away, actually, I should not have said that. I apologise for that unreservedly, or whatever the words might actually be. But it's just and this is the difficulty we get with body corporate stuff and emotions. People get entrenched really quickly, refuse to back down, frightened of being seen to be the bigger person sometimes, and that can lead to catastrophic consequences. That's
right. The next one is one that, my next tip is one that might sit poorly with some people, but feel free to debate it if you want. Be proactive in apologising. Again, you might be too late. Don't be stubborn about it. If you can see that things are going awry or have gone awry and it seems like an apology might solve, then think very, very strongly about doing it, because at some point you might actually be forced into it. So better to do it voluntarily than to be forced into it. Hey, Frank?
Absolutely, and you know, from a defamation perspective, sometimes with our concerns notices, we will actually send the apology that we're looking for the person that launched the defamatory material to give. So here's what we require. If you do that, we're all good. If you don't, then all bets are off. So here's the actual apology. So sometimes we get into negotiations over the apology itself.
Absolutely.
Not sometimes, a lot of the time.
There can be a lot of wordsmithing that goes into an apology. Now, most of this has been framed from the perspective of somebody who has said or sent something. But what if you're on the receiving end? What about some tips there? Well, again, I think pausing still applies in that situation. Wait for a bit before responding. Think carefully. Do you actually need to respond? No, it's a simple thing, but do you need to? What do you hope to achieve by responding? Is that practical, what you're thinking of? And then if you do respond, think about the tone of that. Don't go nuclear straight away. You've always got the option of action at the end of things, but keep a few cards close to your chest. I personally think you should give the other party an opportunity to retract or clarify. And a really good statement, and I've used this a couple of times in my work career, is to say something like, I'm not sure you actually meant to say what you just said, so I'm going to give you the opportunity to reconsider or retract it. Give them the chance. Because seriously...
No, I meant every word I said, you oxygen thief. Yeah, okay, got it.
Well, that's fine. Well, no. As we said before, after that, if the situation persists, be prepared for a very long, very costly, very stressful undertaking. You've got to answer those questions. Yep.
It is. And it's incredible. You look at the start of these things and where they escalate to. I mean, there's been a massive one up at Tambourine Mountain too.
Yep.
That was the Tambourine Mountain principal and a bunch of teachers on Facebook and all sorts of things. So that's horror story stuff, because it just because the other thing is that you know, today's news is tomorrow's fish and chip wrappers. It really is. And I don't know for everyone else, but at the moment for me, the pace of play is extraordinary. It's just, everything is going so quick. You know, like I'm 46 years old today.
What? No.
Yeah, I know. See, all the hair's coming back. Sometimes I can't remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what happened 3 weeks ago, let alone what was happening 20 years ago. So that heat of the moment when people, you see something, it's in one ear and out the other for the vast majority of people. And that might be different for Jeffrey Rush and Rebel Wilson, all that sort of stuff, that are all the magazines and the rest of it. But in the little Strata land stuff, it's very easy for people to forget and they move on. So it's that degree of objectivity, which is why whether you're on the, you know, the offensive end or the defensive end, pause, 24-hour rule, third-party involvement, and that's even where, from our end as lawyers, clients do reach out from time to time. Park it for a week.
Yep.
Your rights are your rights. You're not losing them by not actioning them immediately.
That's right.
And even it's those email chains. And one of the things I give all of the young lawyers that start with us is you've always got to draft every bit of correspondence like it one day might appear before a judge. And you've got to think about the same thing with these things. So if someone has a go at you and you respond 10 times worse with more defamatory material and it just escalates, that doesn't look good for either one.
Got a couple more points here and then a few questions. So we're getting close to time, so we'll rip through these. Just a couple of quick points about the Commissioner's Office. There's no scope to ask for something to be declared defamatory in the Commissioner's Office. So that's not something that you can seek, nor is there any scope to demand an apology as part of an adjudicator's order. So those sorts of things, they'll need to be pursued in legal proceedings. When we talk about body corporate issues, any comment that's made about a body corporate matter may be a body corporate record, and that can therefore be open to an interested person to copy or inspect. So that email that you sent to another owner in which you bitched and moaned about another owner, about what they said and did at the annual general meeting, that's a record. That is available for someone to get a copy of. That can also be the subject of an adjudicator's order. That can then, of course, be used as the basis for a defamation proceeding. Similarly, in an adjudication, any submission that you make is available to be inspected or copied for quite a few people in the process. So while you may look at an adjudication as fantastic, here's my opportunity to have my say, you need to be very careful about how you have your say, because that is available for other people. Couple of questions here. Elizabeth has asked about a situation apparently where someone that she deals with calls defamation on comments that they don't like, and isn't it only up to a court to decide that? Yep. That's right.
Yep. Courts decide whether whether things are defamatory and whether the things that are imputed are defamatory. There's definitely a limitation in the sense of companies with more than 10 people can't be defamed, and that definitely came up in that vet decision where there were less than 10 employees. So that was a very threshold issue to get across the line. Yep. And that's what I suppose part of this is. People use defamation a lot, but they don't actually get the context right. You know, there are, you know, things called injurious falsehood in a corporate sense. There's the Australian consumer law where people engage in misleading or deceptive conduct and make statements about companies that might not be true, and they're different actionable areas as opposed to pure defamation. Yep. I suppose defamation that we're talking about today is really that injury to someone's personal reputation and their professional reputation in the eyes of an ordinary person.
Question here, how much does an average defamation case cost? How long is a piece of string?
I'd say how big's a circle. But yep. Yes, it is. It's how many things are we arguing over? How long does it go for? Are people insured? You know, but if you, well, at a good rule of thumb, years ago, a client said to me, Frank, I treat litigation like an investment. And if I'm going to get I need to look at what I'm going to spend. And for any litigation, he wanted to get 4 times what he was likely to spend on it. So if he was going to spend 100, he'd want to be chasing 400.
Yep.
And he was a business person. So that was his way to define it. But you came to me with a typical defamation, like you're probably 50 grand starting, and always in these things, you never get back all your costs. Never happens. You know, sometimes you get back half. If you're really lucky, you might get back somewhere 2/3, maybe a tiny bit more, but no matter what, you're going to spend 1/3.
Final question here. If you send an email to an individual to which they take exception and they then broadcast, is the original author liable for defamation contained in the original correspondence? I
would think not, because the person, so if Chris writes to me, Frank, you're a trust account fraudster, that is not, he hasn't published that to anyone other than me. He's accused me of something. If I go out to the world at large and say, Chris Irons just called me a trust account fraudster, I'm the one that's published it. So I'm the one that's defamed myself. So yep. Oh, another one there, Chris. Committee talks about owners in their absence. Well,
and then those comments are repeated to who they were talking about. Is that defamatory?
Could be. Absolutely could be. Again, back to what the comments actually were, whether the imputations in them are true, and so on. So basically almost everything's capable, well, not everything. Chris is such a good guy. I really enjoy working with him. Hardly likely for that to be defamatory, but anything in a negative sense absolutely could be defamatory.
Yep.
But we're talking about the context of doing something about it is a massive thing. And what we really are about is trying to tone things down. As much as the reality in Strata is that you've all shown an interest to be here today, and of course, people will be watching this for months to come, who've shown an interest in trying to find a little bit about it. The people that are going to get in trouble are the ones that won't bother.
Yep, that's right.
Looking at this sort of stuff.
That's right.
Go off half-cocked and away you go.
That's a fantastic point in which to wrap things up, Frank. And look, a lot of what we've talked about today veers towards the idea of body corporate communication, body corporate records. So that is actually a really good segue for maybe not next week's webinar, but perhaps the webinar after that, where we might sort of pick up from this point and follow it through on the issue of body corporate records.
We could even do a little bit of privilege, couldn't we?
Wow. Okay.
Get really legal.
Yeah. All right. It's on the agenda. Look, with that, we might wrap it up there. Frank, it's been a pleasure.
As always, mate. Thank you, everyone, for showing up.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate it. There are many things you could be doing. I heard me say this before. There's a lot more you could be doing on a Friday afternoon than this. So we appreciate you taking the time. Please don't forget to like and share. don't forget to tune in to our Facebook page for both the topic reveal and also the link where you can register to attend.
Or
Stay
Twitter.
tuned, or Twitter, or
See,
LinkedIn.
I'm the tweeter. Chris is the Facebooker. So we've almost got an internal competition as to who gets more likes. At the moment, Chris is winning, so I'm feeling particularly unloved.
I'm sure it'll change. I'm sure it'll change. But yeah, stay tuned. We'll see you hopefully all again next week.
Cool.
Talk
Bye,
to you later.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.